Hey friend, it's your old pal Scott, and this week we're going to try to paint this miniature with this 3-inch brush. Do you think I can do it? I'm really not certain, but we're going to give it a try. First off, how was your week? I don't know if you can put a restraining order on a cat, but it's worth a try. We're going to try to paint this miniature with this brush. Now, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, why on earth would you even try to paint a miniature with so much detail with a 3-inch brush? Well, when I first got into the hobby, I had some friends that had been in the hobby for quite some time, and I noticed that when he dry brushed, he used like a 1/2-inch wide brush, and his stuff still came out perfect, but I was like, wait a second, I'm using like a quadruple zero brush here for all my detail because I didn't have the fine motor skills that you eventually develop while you're painting. And I said, how can you paint with such a large brush? I didn't understand how he was doing it. And he said, well, the longer you paint, the bigger the brush. And that's an old adage that I've actually heard more than one person say in this hobby. The reason being is that the better you get with your skill of brush control, the more you can get done with a larger brush, and you don't need to get the fine detail. I'm gonna paint the very best I possibly can using this brush, and we'll see how it goes. My randomly chosen skin color ended up being Wild Rider Red, so I knew I had to use Scrag Brown as a base coat. Then for the glowing weapon, I'm going to use the white and then the yellow contrast on top of it. And for the pants, of course, Wall Flesh and then Elysian Green as the highlight. Then all the leather stuff is going to be Mournfang Brown. And just to shake things up a little bit, I decided for Eshin Gray as the base. One thing a lot of people don't know about dry brushing is you always want to start with the innermost places and then work your way out. So I was able to use that Scrag Brown and really dry brush a good portion of the model, color all of his skin, but of course it was getting everywhere else, but it doesn't matter because we're going to start inside and work our way out. Being that I've never done this with a 3-inch brush before, I ran into an issue immediately. While trying to wash off the Scrag Brown off the brush, I realized that the brush holds onto a ton of moisture that a normal size brush does not. So when I start dry brushing this green on here, it's like really watery and it's a real pain in the butt because no matter how much I dry brush this brush onto like a rag to dry it out, it really didn't want to and it came out very watery. You could actually see a bubble on that blade. So I had to come up with a different approach because I could not just wash my brush like you normally would with a smaller brush. So I would try to rinse out the brush and it would retain water, and then it would also retain some of the paint because of all the bristles. You see the green on my hand just then. I'm trying to get this brush to be dry. And I realized that I just can't wash out my brush. That's not something I'm going to be able to do with this like you normally could with a regular brush, because everything stays so wet if you use water. Now I've done the highlights for the skin, but I'm going to end up going back over that, and I've got the base coat for the pants. I decided to just take the corner of this brush and try to do some highlighting for this set of pants. One thing I learned is that it does not brush very well. You have to basically stab stuff with these bristles. These bristles do not hold a lot of paint, and you see this is looking pretty messy now. They don't hold a lot of paint, and in order to get into the small recesses, you basically have to just get a tiny amount of paint. Do you see what I just put on that brush? A tiny, tiny amount of paint, and then stab into the recesses. It was a very different experience than normal. And if that wasn't enough, I also learned that obviously all of those bristles, even the ones that don't have paint on them, are all on the same plane. So what would end up happening is the ones without paint would end up running into the parts of the model that stick out, and they would end up bowing or bending, and then they press against the bristles that you're trying to do. I'm trying to paint his hair there, his beard and his hair with this giant brush. Anyway, they would end up bending and they would push the bristles that you do have paint on away from what you're trying to paint. It was like they were playing goalie for you, and it was a real pain in the butt. Now I'm doing the base coat that I'm going to end up doing the Eandin yellow on to make it fiery. But even this, I found I had to stab. For some reason, like the surface tension of the paint would not allow me to actually paint anything. And there's some white highlighting on the gray. And I had a hard time brushing at all. Now, it could just be the type of brush. It was the nylon bristles or whatever. It wasn't like horsehair or anything like that. And of course, it's a giant brush, way larger than it should be. You see I'm putting silver on there. But I was basically able to get just a few hairs or bristles from the brush and paint things like his blade there, and later on when I do more highlighting. At this juncture, I'm still trying to figure out how to do all of this stuff, but I think I'm starting to get it at this point in the paint job. So I definitely cannot rinse out my brush. I have to just dry it on a rag and make sure that, going for some leather here, the boots and the sack on his back and the handle to the blade. Anyway, I could not wash out my brush at all, so I would just dry it as best I could so no more paint was coming off when I rubbed it on like my hand or a rag, and then I just had to put the new color of whatever the paint is that I was doing on top of that, on top of the bristles. It made the brush really messy, and I did not care for doing that, but that's the only way I could get this done. And honestly, at this juncture, I'm pretty happy with how this is coming out. It is not perfect by any standpoint, but I'm actually adapting and overcoming the issues of trying to use a massive, massive brush. Now, this is an issue. Using just a couple bristles doesn't hold hardly any contrast. So I really struggled getting the contrast to stick on this blade because I could never get enough of it on there for it to sag. You know how it's really runny and it sags and causes that gradient effect. I really couldn't get that to work, so that's probably my least favorite part of this entire model. Oh, this is me going for the little bones. Look, I'm using one or two bristles doing the bones in his backpack. But I was never able to accumulate enough Iyanden yellow on that blade for it to actually drain and cause the gradient. Here's more highlighting with that Wild Rider red, which is very orange. And then at this point, I realized that that bracelet on his arm, I forgot to do that in silver, so I'm going to have to go back for that. Really, at this point, I'm in the finishing touches of the whole thing. I'm desperately trying to get some Seraphim Sepia on that metal. I eventually do manage it, and you can actually see some of the orange and the brown from previous paint jobs on those bristles end up on there. There's me doing the bracelet right there in silver, touching up the blade, doing the backs of his boots, and touching up some brown on his boots. Then finally the Eshin Gray. You notice I'm working farther and farther out. I started with his face and his beard and all of that, and I'm working all the way out to the actual basing, and I'm pretty much done at this juncture. And the final thing I did was some highlighting on his bag, which really didn't show up once it was dried, but at least you can say I put in the effort. Overall, I mean, this is certainly not my best paint job I've ever done, but it is the best paint job I've ever done with a 3-inch brush. So I guess that's a win-win, right? If you're willing to play against an army painted this well with a 3-inch brush, then you have no excuse at all not to paint your army. Because you can say, oh, I'm a terrible painter. You can't be worse than painting with a 3-inch brush. Anyway, I'll see you next week. Thank you so much for everybody for supporting the show, watching it. Please like, subscribe, all of that jazz. I'm so thrilled you actually made it to the end of the show. And thank you for all my beautiful, sexy, good-smelling Patreon patrons. They're fantastic. Thank you all. I appreciate it so much. Hey, you made it to the super secret end of the video, and I appreciate you doing that. In the comments, I would like to know your opinion of whether or not that paint job actually turned out better than you were expecting, equal to, or worse than you were expecting. I would really like to know that. So put that in the comments, and thank you so much for watching.